Welcome to the introductory lecture on American modernism. Let's begin here. Realism was the dominant American aesthetic in writing for roughly the second half of the 19th century. Writers worked under the belief that they could accurately represent, as much as language would allow, the exterior world in prose. That is, they believed that stories on the page, if they were good writers, objectively represented the world around them. Working under this belief, at times, writers saw fiction as an art form where authors could better understand or even explore solutions to social problems such as the inequality between men and women. If American culture was carefully observed, a writer then would be able to replicate American culture on the page. If a social correction presented in fiction worked to improve society in the novel, it should then work to improve society in the real world. The extension of creating a documentary art form at times produced the belief that fiction might be an art form in which writers could perform effective social experiments about ways to improve American life. For the Romantics, at times, fiction functioned as an argument whereby an author presented specific ways to view a historical event, such as the American Revolution or early Puritan life in Massachusetts, hoping to persuade readers to a particular interpretation of the past. But for realists, at times, fiction became the place where they explored ways to overcome societal problems and consider ways to move forward. This arrangement was underpinned by the notion that literary fiction was now an objective art. It should strive to represent the exterior world accurately on the page. In my view, American realism comes to an end for three reasons, a couple of which authors should have seen coming, and one that likely caught them off guard. At its inception, authors of realism claimed that Romanticism was a biased aesthetic. It worked largely to represent upper-class lifestyles in fiction and also sought ways to explore the concerns of the wealthy while ignoring the middle class and the poor. In the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, for example, many of the protagonists are so wealthy that they own large houses, employ servants, and have no discernible job. Even when Poe wrote about a working-class character, such as with the narrator of The Telltale Heart, it is with an eye toward the wealthy. The Telltale Heart, essentially, is about an old man wealthy enough to hire a servant to take care of him. Only the servant, in a fit of madness, kills him. Though the story is told from the killer's perspective, the drama plays on the fears of the wealthy as if to say, "Oh, you who have the money to hire servants, be very careful about who you let into your house, or they might do you in." In response to Romantics' preoccupation with the wealthy, the realists presented an aesthetic that, at least in theory, would explore the whole panoply of class in American society, from poor to the rich. But as with other elements of realism, what was proposed in theory isn't exactly what happened in practice. Novels of realism tended to focus on the concerns of the middle class or the average person. And in this, aren't the realists doing more or less what they accused the Romantics of doing? Namely, focusing on one class group to the partial exclusion of the others? Likewise, because realists were interested in representing the average experience of an American citizen, their plots tended to focus on those challenges that many people experience. The majority of realist stories, I believe, can be placed into just three categories. 1. Stories of maturation, that means growing up. 2. Stories about domestic trouble, such as problems in a marriage. And 3. Stories about workplace trouble. And I think here the issues are obvious. Literature during this period repeatedly directed readers back into life experiences that they understand. Fiction during the period of Romanticism often elevated individuals up out of their everyday lives and presented fantastical experiences of killers, vampires, witches, and other unique situations. That is, during the period of realism, the reduction in the emphasis of plot left some readers hoping for more exciting experiences to be the basis of literature. But the most significant shift has to do with a revolution in how people understood the capabilities of the human animal. In the 1800s, humans believed generally that they were capable of understanding the world around them objectively. Writers could take that objective understanding of the world around them and represent it on the page. The work of Sigmund Freud disrupts many beliefs that humans more or less held for centuries. For many, Freud's theories at the time were threatening and disorienting. Sigmund Freud conjectured that the unconscious was the repository for repressed experiences and coded dreams. He believed that people were highly individualized beings, each uniquely influenced by his or her past, leading individuals to view the world in subjective and personal ways. According to Freud, though of course there was an absolute objective reality out there somewhere, humans and how the mechanics of their brains were assembled couldn't know objective reality. They could only view the outside world through a highly subjective lens. For people living in the early 20th century, these ideas were intimidating. Freud was saying that ultimately, we are alone. No one understands the world in the same way that we do, and perhaps more importantly, no one will ever understand us. You are isolated, even from yourself. And by that I mean, Freud was saying that human beings sometimes do things that they know they don't want to do. The human creature doesn't always understand its own motivation, and the mechanisms of the mind create a natural barrier between who a person thinks he or she is from the reality of that person's existence. If you had grown up in a world where you believed that you could see the world with objectivity, that you understood yourself, and that you followed careful plans, Freud was saying essentially that in some of these areas, to some extent, you had deceived yourself. You had created an illusion of yourself in the world around you that feels like the truth, but in fact is not the truth. In this, Freud also dealt a fatal blow to realism, in that by extension he was saying, "Oh, you writers of realism, you have deceived yourself for years. You think you are replicating the exterior world on the page with objectivity, but you aren't even capable of seeing the world objectively. You can only understand the world through a highly individualized lens, a lens that has been colored by your parents' beliefs, your level of education, the pains and joys you've experienced in relationships, and a million other things." For writers of literature, this creates a fundamental problem. For decades, writers such as Mark Twain and Kate Chopin had been suggesting that the language on the page was presenting an accurate image of American life. That is, language presents an objective version of American culture. But Freud was saying this wasn't possible. What these authors had actually been doing without realizing it was presenting their own highly subjective understanding of American culture as objective truth. The problem is this: if language can no longer attach itself to the exterior world, what then does language in fiction, which we call prose, what then does prose attach itself to? What then does language reveal? For American modernists, there are two large answers to this problem. That is, what then does prose represent for the modernist writer? Let me back into the first answer a little bit by saying this. Freud creates problems for literary novelists, but he also brings opportunity. With Freud's theories and those of other early psychologists, the human creature suddenly becomes more interesting and complex. At the start of the 20th century, which art form allows the best access to the movement of the human mind and the development of the human character over time? Well, visual art, such as paintings, may allow viewers to perceive the world from a compelling point of view, but they don't offer a sustained or evolving viewpoint. Music may offer expression of human experience, but again not at length or attached to time. It is primarily novels, which are primed to best benefit from this new interest in the human mind. Novels can show how the mind or soul responds to situations moment by moment. Novels can demonstrate how experiences absorbed early in life defined a character's worldview and actions later in life. Novels, specifically those that advance realism's interest in character, are perfectly arranged for the artistic space where these new ideas of psychology can play out in dramatic form. Now let's loop back to the question as to what does prose represent? Well, one large group of modernists, let's call them the high modernists, believe that prose can represent the thought processes of a single character. In that old formula, language can no longer attach itself in an objective way to the exterior world because the author can't perceive the world with objectivity. But maybe the author understands thought life, as he or she surely experiences this as part of his or her interior experience. There are many elements to a person's thought life: sounds, images, perhaps even aromas. But most people experience some of their thoughts in language. And if thoughts are arranged in language, then language could be able to represent them well on the page. That is, prose language can capture thought language. In high school, we tend to call these narratives stream of consciousness novels, in which the narration follows the thought processes of one character, or at least one character at a time. In American literature, William Faulkner is probably the best example of this type of modernism, specifically with his novel, The Sound and the Fury. This novel is broken into 4 sections that follows the Compson family. The novel opens with the experience of Benji Compson on his 33rd birthday. Benji, though an adult and through a disability, has the language and perception aptitudes of a person who is around 6 or 7 years old. The narrative language, or the prose, presents his thoughts as he moves through his birthday, at times falling into rich memories about his sister Caddy, through impressionistic memories and a limited ability to understand the social environment around him. Faulkner, in this section of the novel, uses language to present the mind of a single character and then to allow readers to understand Benji and his yearnings from the way his thoughts are arranged on the page. The other large group of modernists work to integrate subjectivity into the prose. This is often referred to as style. That is the way a narrative voice textures a sentence to present both an image and offer emotion. For writers in the 19th century, I rarely talk about the uniqueness of their style, as style, with a couple of exceptions, doesn't strongly contribute to a novel's overall meaning. But for writers of the early 20th century, style emphasizes vision and helps create meaning. A writer like Ernest Hemingway, for example, pared back language, leaving out less important details so that the world presented in many of his stories is direct, blunt, and somewhat empty. This narrative style emphasizes the type of brutality that Hemingway often found in the world. This is one way for the subjective vision of the writer to be fused with the narrative presentation on the page. It is as though Hemingway, through his style, is saying, I understand the world in my fiction is not objective, but this use of language allows you, the reader, to see the world as I experience it. But whereas Hemingway's style often brutalizes the presentation of the exterior world, F. Scott Fitzgerald often beautifies it. In his novel, The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald doesn't strive to present an objective presentation of New York in 1922. Rather, he works to beautify it and texture it with meaning. In the same way, an impressionistic painter transforms an image of the world into a unique canvas. In these ways, modernists arranged language so that novels would not only present new characters and new stories, but also the presentation of those elements would have a freshness to them as well. One last element I'd like to touch on, which is the evolving aesthetics of American literature and how the individual aesthetics relate to each other. The realists are antagonistic with the romantics. The realists feel that their literary goals and aesthetics are superior to those of the romantics. In short, the realists want to replace the values of romanticism with the values of realism. But the modernists are not antagonistic with either of the two fiction aesthetics that precede them. One way of looking at an aesthetic is this. It is a box that explains what type of storytelling is literature and what is entertainment. Stories that conform to the elements of the aesthetic can be placed inside the box and are literature. Stories that don't are entertainment. For the realists, a story needed to be set during an author's lifetime and also present the culture of a region where the author had lived for many years. This was the entry point for a work possibly to be considered literature. But after 100 years of American fiction, the modernists largely want to embrace both romanticism and realism as if collectively they are saying, we find useful traditions in both aesthetics. Writers should be free to use elements from both traditions to create something new. In this way, modernism is a recombinant art. For example, The Great Gatsby is utterly fascinated with the lives of the wealthy, which is a core element of Romanticism, yet it's invested in a relatable presentation of New York in 1922, that is, one region during a specific period of history just after the war. This relates to the traditions of realism. Another example, The Great Gatsby is also focused on elaborate and unusual plots. There's murder, affairs, crime, which of course grows out of the Romantic tradition. Yet the novel is also interested in how the environment of the Midwest produced a person like Nick Carraway. And that exploration of environment and personality is something that rises up out of realism. Modernism, in essence, tells writers that you are free to combine useful elements of realism and romanticism in ways that will create a compelling story. Again, it's a recombinant aesthetic, so long as the novel also does three more things. First, the novel has to have some consistent way for readers to understand what prose represents, whether it's the thought life of a protagonist or the subjective idiosyncratic vision of a narrator. And in this, the style of narration must also advance the meaning or mood of the novel. Second, the novel, of course, accounts for a new understanding of human interiority. Namely, it absorbs an understanding of psychology to present characters that are richly developed and thoughtfully presented on the page. And third, the novel not only tells and presents narration so that its style textures meaning, but the work also explores a significant idea that is central to the larger human experience or world issues. Again, from The Great Gatsby, in addition to being a love story, the novel wants to explore the ways that the American dream, that is, the belief that we have strong power over our future work identities, shapes our personalities and, at least in Fitzgerald's view, damages our souls. In this, modernism is placing a premium on intellectual themes. In other words, representing life is no longer enough to be considered literature. The novel now needs to explore a serious idea as well. And in this, the box of literature more or less is defined for modernism. Modernism will be the dominant American aesthetic for literature from 1910 up through 1945. And that is roughly, though not exactly, the space between the two world wars. Outside of this box, there are many stories that don't even attempt to accomplish the elements associated with this new understanding of literature. For example, mystery novels are very popular during the period of modernism, but they are rarely considered literature. They are mostly considered entertainment. And with this, American literature adds layers of complexity to itself as it becomes the central artistic medium in which new psychological theories can be presented in dramatic form.